Hello and welcome to this video. It's more of a test really to see what the viability of teaching a A-level music technology course on videos would be and what it would look like and whether it would be useful for people. I have a target in mind, but hopefully it could be useful for everyone. So this video is going to be on compressors. It's going to be about as it's aimed at A-level music technology students, AS level to some extent, too, as the crossover between AS level and A level is, knowledge base is basically the same. They just expect you to get better. So this is quite theory based. This is not a video on how to compress your drums to make them sound awesome, or how to make your vocals sit right in a pop track. It's not about that. I suppose I could make videos like that down the line if this works. This is a video very much on the theory and the controls of compressor, why you would compress, and what mechanically each of the controls is doing. Oh, please excuse my casual bedroom surroundings. It's currently 2020 and we're in COVID-19 lockdown. If these go ahead, I'd like to do these at the studio where I work, just because it would look better. Not that you need a studio, you just need a computer. Right. Compressors, yes. So what a compressor does, in the most basic of terms, before you start thinking about all of the and thens, let's start at the very beginning. What a compressor does, it can make loud things quiet. That's it. It doesn't do it like a fader. It's a fader. It's not like turning up and down a fader on a track, which makes an entire track louder or quieter. It's there to make moments within a recording, within a track, quieter if they're loud. So why would you do that? Why would you want to make loud things quieter? There are kind of two goals. One is to level out the performance in terms of volume. Obviously you've captured probably a human performance of some instrument, drums, guitar, piano, and there will be variations in the dynamics of that performance. Dynamics, just another term for the loudness and quietness of a piece of audio. More to do with like the difference between loud and quiet, and that's fine. And you want to flatten them out. You'd want to do that because you make it more controllable, more predictable for your mix, and you can handle it better. It also sounds more pleasant to many. Is you don't totally, just by taking the volumes, flattening the volumes out, you don't actually lose the sense of human variation of loud and quiet, because you get tonal differences as well as some volume differences. But you get a lot of tonal differences in the way a drum's been hit loudly or softly, or a piano's been hit loudly or softly. So even if you level out the actual real volumes, shouldn't use the word volumes, by the way, the actual loudness of those moments, you still maintain the humanity of the performance in other aspects, but you do make it more controllable, and more manipulable. Not sure what the word is there, but you can do more things with it. You can predict it better. It just makes the mix sound better. And the second reason is possibly the reason you may be aware of, or most people will be aware of, if they've been into this at all for any length of time, is that you can make it sound louder. I know I've said the goal of a compressor is to make a loud thing sound quieter, but you can actually then turn the whole thing up to make it sound louder. This is because in the digital world, and actually in the analog world as well, there is a ceiling on how loud something can be. Digital is absolute brick wall, 0 dBFS, nothing can be louder than that. But as humans, as people, we perceive loudness from the average loudness of a track. We don't perceive the tiny spikes or the transients of a noise. If we look at my snare drum I've got here, this spike here, we wouldn't hear that as such. We'd hear what is the general overall loudness of that waveform, what's the average. So by reducing the loud spike down towards the average spike, That's reducing the dynamic range. We're compressing. That's why it's called a compressor. We're compressing that dynamic range into a smaller thing. We can then, remember our full scales up here, turn everything up, increasing the average loudness and increasing our perception of the loudness of the track and making it sound louder, which is desirable up until a point, that is. Obviously, if you turn everything too much, compress it too much, it sounds distorted, it begins to sound hollow. Over compressed is an unpleasant sound, and especially at the mastering stage over recent years or decades, it's, as an industry, we've been really guilty of over compressing, and that's thanks now to streaming really sort of dialing back to being more about how good something can sound if it's compressed right. So there's a middle ground. Uncompressed doesn't. It's not that it doesn't sound good. It just it's a way. In pop music, rock music, you're not going to get away with something that's uncompressed. Maybe some sort of folky acoustic music you can, but too compressed just sounds like a horrible mess. So it's about finding that middle ground. So yes, we're going to talk about compression, the mechanics, and essentially what each dial, each control of the compressor does, and hopefully help you understand that. So let's look at this. I've got up a few compressors. I'll talk about these ones later, only because some terminology changes. But we're going to use this central compressor, which is the very common sort of looking compressor you'll find on most software. First dial you need to be aware of is the orange one, threshold. Now, when it comes to an exam, you're likely to be asked about compressors or most sort of things like this. There's always like a more detailed answer, but within the context of an exam, you might be given, and this is AS level and A level, a question where you are asked to describe what each control on a compressor does, and each control will give you 2 marks, for instance, and therefore you kind of need 2 sentences to get those 2 marks without writing too much and wasting your time about what each one does. And you say like, bish bash bosh, says 12 marks, done, just for having these sentences kind of like bang 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 in your mind. So that's what I'm kind of focusing this video towards, really, in terms of terminology. So threshold, when you're talking about getting those double marks, you need to mention what it does, and you need to really mention sort of the unit of measurement, which is always written on these things. So threshold, the point at which compression starts in decibels. So maybe the point at which in decibels compression will start. Therefore, signal above that is louder than the threshold will be compressed, and signal that is quieter than threshold will not be compressed, in the most basic terms. So let's say I set this at, where I got it, 17.1 decibels. A signal that comes into that compressor at 16, 15 decibels. Remember, lower numbers are louder sounds because we're always working in minus figures. Sometimes I don't always say minus. Will be compressed, and a signal that comes into that compressor at minus 20 will not be compressed. Pretty simple. Next dial, most important one, is ratio. Now we're going to start looking at this graph here, which is quite a common way of showing compressors in software. And to understand it, what we have along the bottom, it's not labeled here, we have basically the volume that the signal comes in at in decibels, and along the left, along the y-axis, we have the volume that the signal goes out at in decibels. So this starts to matter when you start talking about ratio. So ratio is the amount, again, sort of tick mark, amount of compression applied above the threshold. It is a ratio. It doesn't have its own unit of measurement. Ratio is just ratio. For instance, if I have a ratio of 2 to 1, it always goes to 1. If I have a ratio of 2 to 1, signal above, say I put in extra 2 dB of threshold, if I put in 2 dB of signal above the threshold, I'll only get 1 dB of signal above the threshold coming out. And you can see how that creates this little angle in our graph. This white line is the sort of, how would you describe that white line? It's the point at which the signal is hitting, I guess. So if I turn it up to 5.2 to 1, it would take 5.2 decibels of input signal to output an extra 1 decibel above the threshold level. Then the next, it's not such an important dial in compressors terms, but the next dial, this is easy to understand at this point, is knee. Now what knee does, if I dial it up, it's actually not very often a dial, it's a dial here. Are there any knee options on my other compressors? Knee wasn't really a sort of thing in old compressors like all these. You know, they had their own sort of built-in knees thanks to their componentry, and it was part of the character of that compressor. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Often I find that as a switch, and we'd find a switch between hard knee and soft knee options. So a hard knee is this one, where signal that is, you know, fractionally above the threshold. So our threshold is at minus 17.1. If we put in 17 dBs of signal, that will be compressed, and if we put in 16.9 minus 16.9 dBs of threshold, that will not be compressed. It's bang on, crosses threshold, start compression. What knee does, you'll notice as I dial it up, it smooths out the start of the ratio either side of the threshold mark. So it's measured in decibels, and that is just how many input decibels it takes to get to full ratio. And that's spread evenly, so 15 dBs, in this case, either side of the threshold, it will be curving into the ratio. That's nice for more subtler uses of EQ, maybe in vocals or things that aren't so transient and attacky. You can just sort of even out slowly, especially if your signal is often around the threshold mark and not often slamming above it. So in terms of that, in terms of your exam, if you're asked about knee, I'd definitely mention hard knee and soft knee in your answer. So you'd say something like a soft knee compressor introduces the ratio slowly as the signal approaches and crosses the threshold. A hard knee compressor introduces the ratio immediately as the signal crosses the threshold. Something like that. And this graph is a really nice way of showing a release. And you'll see this on the Cubase one and other things. And threshold. So if you lower, obviously you begin to have much more dramatic effects on your ratios. Next two dials, in fact, we're going to talk about one that isn't on any of these compressors here because it's one that's on the Cubase compressor, and I know that it's been asked about before. And I'll get to that. Then we're going to think about, are these time-based dials, attack and release, and the Cubase one is that I'm referring to mysteriously is called hold. And the best way I think to demonstrate this is to try and switch over to a graph that is it's got time. I've actually got this whiteboard software here. Oh dear, I didn't set it up, did I? Doop-a-doo, not that. I've got it's like a background thing. Wow, I'm clicking all the wrong things. Apologies. Right. I'm going to create a square, a rectangle. This is going to be my graph. And then, is this the paper? Yes, here we go. I can do like a grid paper. There we go. So this is going to be a graph. It's going to be time along the bottom. Make that bolder. Time. Trying to do this on a trackpad. And this is going to be over loudness. I'm just lazy. I'm going to call it volume. Now, I try to avoid using the term volume because actually volume is a measurement of, well, volume is the amount of air being moved. That's why we consider it loudness. When things are loud, it's moving a lot of air, a volume of air. Within the computer, when we're talking, or within a studio, we should really be talking about loudness. And let's say, for instance, our signal's coming along with not a lot of volume, and it's going to be a drum, so it's going to hit hard, and then it's going to sort of tail off. It's like a time over volume graph. The time will be in milliseconds, the volume was going to be in decibels, lowercase d, capital B, because deci is 10, bells is the measurement, so 10 bells, decibels. And we can talk about a compressor in terms of this. So what we can do is set a threshold. Let's say our threshold is going to be here, right? Threshold. Let's dash that right across actually. Nice. And that goes across, so if this signal comes again later when it crosses the threshold. So before we think about attack and release, we'll just quickly talk about, go back to talking about ratio so we can understand the graph that I'm drawing again. So let's do it in yellow. So for every, say we've got a ratio of 2 to 1, every dB above this line is essentially halved. So let's do it every time we cross. 1, 2, 3, so that's 1.5. That'll be there. Next time I've missed an important one, but so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it'll be 4. 1, 2, 3. So excuse the lazy counting. But there, it's going to spike somewhere in between, isn't it? There, for instance, here. Let's be quite quick about it. Let's do that and say, for instance, that with a ratio of 2 to 1, our compressor now does that. Oh, that's a bit wonk, isn't it? Try and be better. This signal now does that instead of the green line once it crosses the threshold. So that's understanding ratio. We've reduced this dynamic range from all of this. This was the dynamic range. Now the dynamic range is, well, essentially that goes always down to the bottom, is that. All the way down to the bottom. That's a reduction of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 dB, which then means we can turn everything up 5 or 6 dB. We can get it to be sound 5 or 6 dB louder, although it doesn't quite work out like that once you get into the practicalities of it, but it's loose maths. We can think of it like that. So what does attack do? Attack here. You're going to have attack and release on every compressor you find. Not something really old, that's just this big time constant. So we've got attack, release, other functions we're not going to worry about. Attack, this one's in clicks, you don't get release. Attack and release, they're critical functions. Often you find an auto release over here. Anyway, attack. What attack does? The length of time, this is your mark thing, length of time in milliseconds taken for the full compression to be applied once the signal crosses the threshold. Full amount of ratio compression to be applied once the signal crosses the threshold. And that's pretty easy to understand, I hope. Our signal crosses the threshold here at this point. And let's do this in, I'm running out of colours, let's do this in blue. Let's say we have a 20, I do each of these blocks as 10, let's say we have a 20 millisecond attack time, right? Let's just for the sake of it, set that to 20. There we go. The attack will sort of allow some of this original spike to start coming through before it gets to 2, a ratio of 2 compression. I mean, that's not a lot to actually show you, but you would imagine that a graph comes up somewhere along the original line, and then by the time the ratio stops, by the time the attack time stops, it's onto its full ratio of compression, which comes down here somewhere. So we're just creating this little spike that can, in drums in particular, really important to not lose your transient hits, to not lose the punch come through. And in drums, I'd normally find an attack time of 30, 40 milliseconds, quite normal. Be wary of these dials. This one is showing 35 milliseconds all the way over here at like 2 o'clock. But that's not always the case. For instance, it's not necessarily in milliseconds, this one. But sometimes the attack dials have different scopes in them. In fact, they often have different scopes. So sometimes an attack dial will go all the way up to 100 milliseconds. Sometimes they'll only go to 50, so the whole range. So you can't just say because this one's at 2 o'clock, I apply it at 2 o'clock on all of my other compressors. You have to be aware of the numbers, okay? So release, kind of in the opposite way of attack. release is the length of time taken for the compression to be fully released after the signal has crossed back down below the threshold, again in milliseconds. Although some of these are normally longer numbers. Look, we've got seconds up here, 3.3 seconds, 4 seconds, that's a long release. So whilst these might change, look, that's gone to microseconds, which is tiny, tiny stuff. It's always in seconds, milliseconds, something like that. So our signal crosses back down below the threshold here. Let's try and draw a release time. Let's say we've got a release time of normally longer numbers. Let's go 1, 2, 3, 40. Let's go 60 just for the visuals of it. 60 milliseconds release. That means we continue compressing to here. So now our blue line, which has got the attack and release time, maintains its 50%. And rather than joining there, it's going down to curve to there. It's hard to describe exactly how this happens, but it's taking out this section. Maybe it often look more dramatic than my lines, which have gone a bit wonky, haven't they, would be, but I hope it helps understand that we are maintaining some compression in this period after the signal would otherwise not be compressed, would be back to normal, which again lowers this zone of the transient, this louder average tail section, which again then allows us to increase the perception of average loudness across the board, or at least flatten out the tail a bit more. And you can create some really nuts spikes and things with it. That probably wasn't a useful line, but you can. And I was going to try and show attack and release using this, which is a rendering plugin rather than an inline plugin. I might not know what that means. It means I can very quickly make this waveform, which is just a snare hit, look like it's changed its appearance on the screen. So often you won't actually see the waveform change if you're using plugins live time. So what I shall do is, just for the sake of making it look lots, turn the ratio all the way to 100. Oh, I should have mentioned that ratios in terms of, you would have heard about limiters, I'm sure. A limiter is just a compressor with an infinite ratio, or in the olden days, in the analog gear, infinite wasn't possible. I'm not sure it's possible even in digital, but you can get much higher numbers. So it was just a really high ratio. Anything above, I don't know, 50 ratio could be considered a limiter. I mean, and really, it's a limiter because no matter how much input gain you bang up all the way up to 0, you do not get signal above the threshold. Ignoring attack, of course, because you get a little spike on attack. A brick wall limiter will have a built-in 0 attack, or an attack as fast as it can manage, which often isn't actually 0. So in order, just for drama, what I'm going to do is that's not drama, but just to demonstrate, let's set that, I don't know, I think 14 might be about right, and render this waveform with these compression settings. And now what I hope to see is that you're going to see the loud bits chopped off. Yeah, perfect. So where our signal was here, we've totally chopped it off, we've flattened it out, we've got no release time, so anything that's above the threshold, which appears to be about here in our volume, is now just at the threshold. Because I had such a huge ratio, it all just flattens out across there. If I render that again, same settings again, this time with a little bit of attack, I'm not going to, millisecond, something like that. Hopefully we'll start to see a spike come through the attack. There it is. All of these are actually crossing the threshold a bit much. So if I am just being allowed through, so we're way too short on the release for me to visually show you. Let's put a bit of release on. Hopefully we'll see what I'm after now. That's more like it. So we've got this spike that has come through, then the rest is being compressed in the release time of that initial spike. And about here we're not seeing any compression whatsoever. So we're creating a spike come through. If we then have a undo that again, lower threshold, you might even be able to see the release kind of work on the same idea. Oh dear, that didn't work at all. Much too low. Just try and find a signal that shows you what I'm after. Not really. compress hard at beginning, quicker release. And you'll notice actually that as you start to dial in attack and release, you actually require lower thresholds than you would do. That's perfect. For gentle attacks and releases. You can see here how our waveforms, this is what I was hoping to achieve. You can see the release, there's no attack, so it's being compressed instantaneously. Our release is about 56 milliseconds. I can probably measure 56 milliseconds on my screen. That's that. You can see how that volume is actually going upwards. It's getting louder, a drum. It's all swell. It would, well, I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do. It would be an interesting drum choice. But you can see how release is going up towards the maximum, the unreleased section. And you can just about, you manipulate this, bit of attack time, let's unrender, that's we're back to natural. Go spike and then pump. And this is where you get pumping, right? Quite pump. Kind of drums that really suck and pump, they go like that. It became popular for a while in EDM music, I suppose it still is. You can get a big spike attack, and then the sucking, pumping noises, and then the natural tail. So you're creating a really trashy drum sound. In actual terms, I'd never use a ratio of 100 on the drums, 8, it's about right. Attacks of about 30, releases, that changes more often, quite quick normally. You start just slightly to trim and tame this. This is a more realistic use of the compressor. Oh, that's too much. But you can see how you're changing the shape of the drum here. And then finally, last dial you need to know is gain, makeup gain. So what I can do is let's set this back down to being fairly ridiculous where we were at before, and I render that. There we go. That is maybe too ridiculous. Render that and we just create this tone. What I can do is use makeup gain to make the entire thing louder. If I turn that all the way up there, we're just going to see a massive great, yeah, there it is, right across there. That won't sound, well, I'm not going to say it's the wrong thing to do, but don't do it by accident, right? It's a creative choice to make a drum that sounds like a Hoover. But you can see what makeup gain is doing. It's giving us a general volume lift after you've done your attack and your knee and your ratio and your compression, just to bring it back up. The best use of gain is to get it back to the volume it was at in terms of perception, and then you use your faders and other tools maybe to set the actual volume. So we don't want it to sound, obviously when I render it with no gain, that's a lot quieter than I hit. So a little bit of gain would just hopefully render it in the middle somewhere, a bit like that. So we get like it hasn't changed its volume, it's just changed its sound. So I've brought up these other compressors to say that terms change, right? The terminology over time, and therefore in terms of software that you use, if you're using analog emulating software, which a lot is, you may see terms that emulate the terms they wrote on analog when before these things were sort of more decided. So the interesting one is if you look at, like, this is a classic, the 76 compressor, you'll find it everywhere. Doesn't have a threshold. What it has is an input dial. And if you think about it, that's just the same thing. It has a set threshold at a certain level. By increasing the input into the threshold, you are effectively decreasing the threshold. You're putting more signal in, more compression is being applied. So that's this kind of, it works the opposite way. You have to turn it up instead of down, but it's essentially just another term for threshold. This one's got its ratios on buttons. Love all, that's essentially a limiter. And you didn't get an all button on the original Unity, as you just could press multiple of these buttons and add them together. If we look at this one, which is modeled on the SSL famous bus compressor, not much options and ratio. Thresholds total dial. Attack is a click. You can't get in between. You get 1 millisecond, 3 milliseconds. I mean, one of my favorite compressors I use all the time just has fast and slow on attack. That's it. There's no attack dial. It's just a button. You make it fast or slow, and I normally use it slow, which is around about, I guess I haven't actually measured it, I think it's up near 30 because it sounds good on drums where I often like it. You might find auto releases, and what that does is look for the, maybe it's a bit beyond A level, but it looks for how transient it is, and therefore will tailor its release depending on the transient nature of the input. Makeup dial, you might see makeup instead of gain, that's the same thing. This one has output instead of gain or makeup, but these are all the same thing. And this really old compressor, the Fairchild, just has this time constant. I know it's a bit of a mystery what it does, but that's fine, right? So you just sort of, it's changing attack and release somehow. Just play with it. If you have such tools, the trick is, the best thing to do is get a drum up and just play with it. So, or an acoustic guitar or anything. Oh, one thing I should mention before I sign off the video is that you will find on nearly all compressors a gain reduction meter, often labeled GR, and this one, if I play that through, hopefully you'll start to see it flashing. It flashes down to show you how much gain is being reduced out of the signal. On this one, it's switchable, and it's the same here, switchable. The 1 meter on the dial is switchable between GR, gain reduction, in is level in, out is level out, or just an off button, that's not relevant. Same here, GR, in, out. That will be gain reduction on that, because you can see the dial's at 0 before it starts, and so with that, but it's going the other way, just to, you know, just to be confusing. If I were to start rendering that snare through this, there it is. You see the gain reduction, in starts flapping the other way, out, got a bit of soft clipping going on. Now start to see all of these working. Much slower needle time, you just sort of learn, you have to learn your compressors. Not much more gentle. Lagging a bit. Anyway, so that's compression, what each of the dials do. You'll get, you know, bucket load of points, and hopefully that'll give you a foundation to sort of go away and experiment with your compressors and learn what is good for different types of music and stuff, and maybe I'll do a video on that later. So thanks for watching.